The blueprint nobody was supposed to see. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't leaked by accident. It was ignored, filed away so thoroughly that no one thought to look for it again, and that oversight would reshape the industry in ways its authors never intended. For years, this blueprint existed quietly inside a forgotten archive, dismissed as unrealistic, impractical, and dangerously idealistic. Executives skimmed it once, shook their heads, and moved on. Engineers referenced it cautiously, as a thought experiment rather than a plan. It was never meant to be built, until someone did. To understand why this blueprint mattered, we have to return to a moment of strategic fear. The industry faced tightening regulations, rising costs, and shrinking margins. Everyone searched for incremental fixes, lighter materials here, smarter software there. The blueprint rejected that approach entirely. It proposed starting over, not with a new car, but with a new logic. A system where efficiency, safety, manufacturability, and longevity were designed together from the first line on the page. No departments, no silos, no compromises deferred to later stages. Every decision accounted for its impact on every other system. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it was terrifying. The blueprint required collaboration across roles that rarely spoke. It demanded transparency where politics thrived. It assumed patience in a culture addicted to speed. Worst of all, it exposed inefficiencies that entire careers were built around managing. So it was archived, but archives are not tombs. Years later, a small team revisited the document, not because leadership asked them to, but because they were running out of options. Costs were climbing. Complexity was suffocating progress. And buried beneath layers of outdated solutions, the blueprint offered something radical: simplicity. They began testing fragments quietly, not a full implementation, just principles, shared load paths, unified energy management, reduced part counts through structural logic instead of consolidation. Every small test worked better than expected. The blueprint was not theoretical. It was prophetic, and once that realization set in, the team understood the danger they were facing, because building from that blueprint wouldn't just create a better car. It would reveal how inefficient everything else had become. And that kind of truth never stays hidden for long. The more the team tested the blueprint's principles, the harder it became to stop. Each small success unlocked another layer of possibility. Systems simplified instead of growing. Interactions became predictable instead of fragile. Costs fell as performance rose, not through compromise, but through alignment. This was not optimization. It was subtraction. The blueprint questioned why so many parts existed at all. Why brackets reinforced structures already strong enough. Why software compensated for mechanical inefficiency instead of preventing it. Why redundancy meant duplication instead of resilience. With each answer, entire assemblies disappeared. Engineers watching from the outside were unsettled. The design violated unspoken rules, not technical ones, but cultural ones. It suggested that complexity had been mistaken for sophistication, that layers of process masked fundamental waste, and that the industry's obsession with managing problems had replaced the act of eliminating them. Leadership was briefed cautiously. Early reports were framed as cost-saving initiatives, not philosophical revolutions. Numbers were highlighted, risks softened, but even through careful language, the implications were clear. If the blueprint scaled, it would render entire departments redundant. Validation cycles would shrink. Supplier relationships would change. Power would shift. The response was immediate. Oversight increased. Documentation multiplied. Reviews slowed progress. What had begun as quiet exploration now attracted attention that felt less curious and more defensive. The blueprint wasn't being evaluated. It was being contained. Yet containment only amplified its impact. Engineers from other teams began requesting access. They recognized the patterns instantly. The blueprint solved problems they fought daily: cooling, weight, durability, serviceability. It addressed all of them by refusing to treat them separately. Some attempted to replicate its ideas in isolation. They failed. The blueprint didn't tolerate partial adoption. It demanded coherence. You couldn't borrow a chapter without rewriting the book. That rigidity became its shield. Critics argue it was unrealistic precisely because it required systemic change. Proponents countered that incrementalism was no longer sustainable. Both sides were right, and that stalemate defined the blueprint's fate. But while debate raged, something irreversible happened. A working prototype emerged. Not a showpiece, not a flagship, a quiet, functional machine built by people who believed less could truly be more. It wasn't revolutionary in appearance. It didn't announce itself. It simply performed. And performance has a way of ending arguments. The blueprint had crossed from theory into reality. And now, it could no longer be dismissed. Once the prototype began accumulating miles, denial became impossible. The machine revealed its strength not through spectacle, but through absence. Absence of failures. Absence of unexpected wear. Absence of the cascading problems engineers had learned to anticipate as normal. Test data showed lifespans extending far beyond projections. Thermal loads stabilized naturally. Software interventions decreased instead of increasing. The car didn't fight entropy, it accommodated it. And that accommodation exposed how much of modern engineering existed only to correct self-inflicted complexity. Executives reacted with controlled alarm. If this blueprint-defined machine reached production unchanged, it would demand explanations no one wanted to give. Why did it use fewer parts? Why did it require less maintenance? Why did it cost less to build while lasting longer? Each answer pointed uncomfortably toward inefficiencies embedded across the organization. The threat was not competitive. It was internal. Departments built around optimization, validation, and lifecycle management found themselves defending relevance. Supplier contracts based on volume rather than necessity came under scrutiny. Processes designed to manage failure looked excessive when failure stopped appearing. So the blueprint faced its greatest challenge, not technical scrutiny, but political gravity. Leadership ordered a comparative study. The prototype was benchmarked not against competitors, but against the company's own best-selling models. The results were devastating. Over time, the blueprint machine outperformed them in durability, costability, and customer satisfaction metrics. It didn't win every category, but it won the ones that mattered after sale. And that was the problem. Short-term excitement favored traditional models. Long-term ownership favored the blueprint. The data suggested a future where cars were sold less often, replaced less frequently, and supported with less intervention. A future that was better for people and worse for revenue cycles built on replacement. The blueprint was suddenly labeled strategically misaligned. Not flawed, misaligned. Engineers understood the meaning immediately. The machine was too honest, too efficient, too revealing. It didn't fit a system that depended on churn, upgrades, and managed dissatisfaction. The team was given an ultimatum: adapt the blueprint to existing business structures, or shelve it permanently. That choice carried weight far beyond one project, because altering the blueprint would mean turning away from a truth already proven, and shelving it would mean accepting a future everyone knew was weaker. The prototype sat in the center of the workshop, flawless and silent, not waiting to be fixed, waiting to be compromised. And the people who built it now had to decide whether progress was something they were allowed to deliver or only something they were permitted to suggest. The compromise came quietly, wrapped in language that sounded reasonable. Leadership approved the blueprint's ideas, but only in fragments, not as a complete philosophy, not as a full reset. Pieces would be extracted, softened, and absorbed into existing platforms where they could improve efficiency without disrupting the machine that fed the business. The original prototype would not go to production. Officially, it was praised as a visionary research success. Unofficially, it was dismantled. Its lessons were redistributed carefully. Part counts dropped here. Load paths simplified there. Software layers thinned just enough to improve reliability without exposing deeper inefficiencies. The blueprint lived on, but diluted, anonymized, and stripped of the coherence that made it powerful. To the outside world, nothing changed overnight. Cars still launched on schedule. Marketing still promised innovation. Roadmaps still marched forward in familiar rhythms. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Engineers who touched the blueprint could no longer ignore what they had seen. They began questioning complexity, Reflexively, they stopped accepting workarounds as solutions. They carried the blueprint's logic with them, quietly reshaping projects wherever they went. The industry didn't reject the blueprint. It absorbed it defensively. Years later, observers noticed patterns they couldn't fully explain. Vehicles grew simpler without looking it. Reliability improved subtly. Ownership costs stabilized. The change felt evolutionary, not revolutionary, but traced back to one forbidden idea: that fewer parts, fewer layers, and fewer compromises could outperform sophistication built on excess. The blueprint nobody was supposed to see never became a product. It became a ghost, a reference point engineers compared everything else against, a silent reminder of what was possible if systems were allowed to be honest with each other. And perhaps that was its true purpose. Not to be built exactly as written, but to haunt the industry into gradual self-correction. Because some ideas are too disruptive to release whole. They must leak slowly. And in leaking, they reshape the future without ever revealing where they came from. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The